Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. And there are several things I could say about this reread experience for me this time. I love this story. I love the pacing, the character work, the addition of Theon Greyjoy in this story, the addition of Davos in this storyline, and what we learn about Stannis, and all the crazy things that happen and build up towards the end of the story. I just had a great time overall. I thought the pacing was fantastic, but I think I'm going to go ahead and focus this particular video on the prologue because something that really stood out to me on this reread was just how powerful this prologue is and how I feel like there were certain elements in this prologue that I think maybe connected to other elements in the story. Some of these ideas, I admit, may be a stretch, but you can all let me know your thoughts in the comment section below after I go through some thoughts. So this will have spoilers, just to be warned. I'm not going to go into detailed spoilers about the whole entire book or what happens at the end or anything, because we're going to be in a spoiler-filled discussion about that over on Joana Sousa's channel. But again, this particular discussion will have spoilers, so you may want to skip this if you haven't read the book yet, or you may want to come back after you finish it and let me know what you think. So this particular book, I love how the prologue starts. I love the first line. The comet's tail spread across the dawn, a red slash that bled above the crags of Dragonstone like a wound in the pink and purple sky. That is a gorgeous line and an ominous one. So I think that this particular first part, the comet's tail spread across the dawn, that sounds beautiful. It sounds almost like a shooting star, the way that you see the echo of something crossing the sky and the dawn. Dawns are beautiful usually. But then the next part of that line, a red slash that bled, right away I'm thinking slash, bleed, I'm thinking of a sword, I'm thinking of blood, and I'm thinking about, with the next part, above the crags of Dragonstone, right away gives you this very brutal medieval hard surface juxtaposition to the vulnerability of being slashed and bled. And then the last part, a wound in the pink and purple sky. So again, wound. And then when you think of pink and purple, that can bring to mind or have connotations of bruising. But at the same time, purple and pink sky can almost be a beautiful thing, Lisa Frank, if you will. But I just think that whole entire line is a very powerful one. And of course, the comet comes up quite a bit in this book. And it's also a powerful thing to add in a fantasy world because as this is a sprawling story, it's also really fascinating to have something like that being seen in the sky from any part of the world. So I love that. I love the different meanings that characters make of that comet. The whole entire prologue is seen from Crescent's perspective. This old maester who is very loyal and fatherly to Stannis Baratheon and is past his prime, so to speak. He is no longer needed. He is seen as no longer functional, yet he's still very loyal and he still holds on to the idea that he has lots of experience. He's been in the world for a while. He knows certain things. And when he sees this comet, he really tries to avoid any superstitious belief about it. He tries to avoid that, but at the same time, he can't help but deny that this happens to coincide with the White Raven bringing the news that summer has ended. And you could tell that he's trying to fight this idea a little bit when he's talking to Shireen, Stannis' daughter, who has grayscales, is described as an ugly little girl. And when she mentions having nightmares of dragons, he thinks right away she's talking about the gargoyles coming to life. And he's like, no, we've talked about this before. And those are just stone gargoyles. There are no dragons in the world. And of course, we as readers know better. Also, he happens to make the observation, by the way, this interesting company of three in sort of a joking way. He's talking about how he's the old maester with the ugly little girl and the sad fool who is Patchface, a very interesting and intriguing character we learn about in this prologue, but that they make a company of three. Patchface, like I said, interesting character, interesting backstory, and he has this interesting way of repeating certain phrases, including something about the shadows come to dance and the shadows come to stay. And anytime you hear a line being repeated, I think it's worth noting. And then we get the introduction of Davos. I like that they right away introduce him as somebody who brings no false hope, or he does not soften the truth, as he brings news to Stannis about how certain lords are making an alliance with Renly, his brother, rather than with Stannis. You, of course, understand that Davos, he used to be a thief, but he renounced that way of being and decided he was very loyal to Stannis. Even though he's brought up, into this place as being the Onion Knight, he doesn't really try to make himself very glamorous. I mean, it seems like he's very humble still in the way that he presents himself and the way he goes about things. And he seems to be a very honorable, honest, loyal person. And you see that juxtaposition, by the way, later on in the prologue when he's sitting at the table at the banquet among all these other lords who are wearing very fine attire. Now, Stannis is described as a very hard man and a very bitter one. He holds no love for his brother Renly, and he holds no love for his brother Robert. And this is kind of a surprise to me. I mean, it was a little bit of a surprise to me to read this, and how he even looks down at Ned, and he's just very bitter. He's such a bitter person. He sees everyone as somebody who's going to stab him in the back, and you can't help but wonder if some of that turns into a self-fulfilled prophecy in a way. He considers killing his own brother at the council, of course, of Melisandre and his wife. But I think it's interesting because this is the man that Ned wanted to put on the throne in book 1. And we're meeting him and we're realizing he's just a very bitter and sour person. And being there at Storm's End, it feels kind of appropriate because the whole entire castle, of course, we have the gargoyles and we have the stone drum and the painted table on top of that. It's a very incredible castle, but there's a austere quality to it. And even just with the way at the banquet later on, how none of his men are shouting or joking or laughing. They're all very quiet. Like there's this strict energy in the air because Stannis doesn't allow that. He doesn't allow people to shout or to laugh or anything like that or banter. It just feels very restrictive being there. The other part is just the way he takes in counsel, because he is willing to take in what Davos has to say because it's not good news, because Stannis is very cynical. But when Creston tries to approach him and tries to offer counsel, saying, the Lannisters are your real enemies, you should try to side with Renly, he doesn't take that to heart at all. And we get some other things in this particular prologue. So we get some mention of the alchemists and the faceless men. So various things I think that are going to provide some seeds for things to come later on. But I did appreciate this whole prologue, especially again from Creston's perspective, because as he says, castles are not friendly places for the frail, and you feel every step as he's trying to make his way on these turnpike stairs, and he's needing some assistance there. His hands are shaky as he's trying to concoct this poison for Melisandre, and you feel it, like his humiliation when he trips into the foal, into Patchface, and Melisandre crowns him with Patchface's helm. Ugh, I don't know, that really got to me. But overall, I also just quickly want to say I love castle settings, and I love the way we saw certain aspects of this castle, the way they were described, the painted table, which I already mentioned, that room, but also when he is looking out in these tall arched windows and he's seeing the castle wall beyond and the fishing village and the men who are practicing archery in the yard with their arrows flying like birds in the sky, and these men who are breaking their fast with cook fires going around them, and they're breaking their fast under a banner. And I love the use of scale. So anytime in story, I love scale. By scale, I mean you get a sense of distance, you get a sense of perspective, of height. And he uses specific numbers. So he'll say things like 12-foot high gargoyles or windows or whatever. And he specifically says, like in that particular scene, for example, that 3,000 men, they sat to break their fast. I like that he uses specific numbers, because even though I can't imagine a specific number, for some reason the use of specific numbers just makes it more real for me. Amazing the way he does that. So a lot of elements again in this prologue, and this whole entire prologue was very interesting with the introduction of Melisandre. The night is dark and full of shadows. Anyhow, I want to go ahead and make some connections now to what I noticed in this prologue and what I already just stated, two parts of the book. So from here, the comet omen, as I already mentioned, this is brought up quite a few times, and I really enjoyed seeing every time it came up in a different character's perspective. And different people wanted it to mean different things. And most people, I think, saw it as a negative sign, but I think it was Varys who mentioned it as the red messenger, which is fire and blood, just something to note. Then the idea about superstition and that whole argument and not wanting to believe in superstition, and the different belief systems at play between Crescent's belief systems and the Lord of Light with Melisandre. I thought that was really interesting because there's a fascinating riddle that Varys introduces, of course, a few chapters later about the power of belief. And he talks about the sellsword and the three men, the man with a lot of gold, the priest, and the king. And each of the three men wants the sellsword to kill the other two. And basically, the message of this riddle is that power resides where men believe it resides. But I think that this idea of belief is a really interesting one as it has a role in leadership. And this is called Clash of Kings. And we have different ways of wanting to rule kingdoms here. We have different perspectives on that and perspectives on leadership in general. So we have Joffrey, who wants to rule the kingdom through tyranny and butchery and being bratty. We have Stannis, who is very sour and bitter and cynical. And even though he doesn't feel like he can win any loyal allies, he does try to manipulate people through belief, through the Lord of Light. He uses religion as a means to control the masses. And then we have Renly, and Renly seems to try to win the masses through charming them. And that does seem to go in his favor to an extent until he dies, basically. And then we have Theon, and Theon has such self-image issues. He's sort of similar to Stannis in some ways, in the sense that he doesn't trust people, but more than anything, he doesn't trust himself, and he doesn't trust others to trust him unless he's seen as scary and horrible. So rather than using religion as Stannis uses it, he instead uses butchery, and he tries to show himself as being a fearful leader. And so it's interesting just to see these different ways of going about leadership, and all of them in their own right, I think, are kind of insecure. Maybe Renly's more narcissistic in a way, or at least he seems not to be very modest. We could say that much. But overall, these are all really ugly forms of being a leader. And we don't get a lot from Rob's perspective in this particular book, but it's just interesting to point those things out. And then we have the role of mentor and counselor. So in the prologue, the main mentor counselor that we're following is Crescent, and he's being discarded at this point. But other people that fit this role of mentor and counselor, and I'm not really in favor of listing a whole bunch of character names, but I do want to mention these characters as I think they kind of fit that role. And so some of these include possibly Varys, Jorah, Halfhand, Jaqen, Hagar, and possibly the Red Priestess, Melisandre, though of course she's very much an opportunist. And actually some of these mentors and counselors may be more opportunists than true loyal mentors and counselors. And we get to figure out their motivations, I suppose, as we read on. But I do think that they serve that purpose to an extent. They all have certain wisdom they want to share or certain ideas they want to offer. And then kind of related to that category, we have the loyal friend. And the loyal friend in the prologue is, I would say, Davos. Again, Davos is noted for the way that he doesn't soften the truth. He is willing to give you a truth, even if it's hard, and tell you how it is. But he also, again, as I mentioned, he doesn't really present himself in a glamorous way, even though he probably could. Even the way that he has his flag with the ship and the onion, I mean, even his sons seem to think that's silly a little bit, but he seems to be very humble. And of course, he comes from a more humble background, even as somebody who was a thief. But he doesn't really try to assert himself into a powerful, glamorous position again. And I feel like that's something that we see with a lot of the loyal friends in this particular book. So some others who come to mind as possibly fitting this role include Samwell Tarly. And again, Samwell, a little different because, of course, Samwell comes from a more noble household, but he doesn't really try to assert himself as somebody who is powerful or glamorous. And same with Brienne. Brienne is just fabulous, but she's also somebody who is willing to look truth in the eye, I think. I mean, when she's willing to sit down with Catelyn and hear Catelyn out and the news that Catelyn has to share about her sons, Rickon and Bran. So I feel like Brienne, it has that loyal quality, but also that willingness to be open to the truth. And we also have Hot Pie and Gendry, I think we could put in this category, and Podrick and Osha and Hodor. Yes, those characters. All of them are more on the humble side, I'd say, and all of them fit that loyal friend category, I would say. And then we have the opportunists, and there's crossover with some of these and opportunists. So Littlefinger, Bronn, I'm considering Bronn an opportunist at this point based on even his own description of himself in book one. And Melisandre, obviously, she's a bit of an opportunist, possibly Varys as well. Reek tries to come across like a loyal friend at first, and we learn that Reek really does stink. I mean, he's an opportunist. One thing I didn't mention about mentors and counselors, especially as far as leadership is concerned, is how Halfhand tells Jon Snow that to lead men, you must know them. And so I feel like there's a lot of preparation around Jon Snow to make him into a leader. That's been building since book one. But that line really stood out to me because I felt like it was an echo back to book one when Robb took the memory of Ned, his father, saying that in order to lead men, you need to let them know you. So I feel like that was an interesting switch there, but a bit of an echo. And then, although this is not referenced in the prologue, I just quickly want to mention the role of motherhood as it comes up in the story, because I feel like that's a big part of this story. We see the role of motherhood through Daenerys' storyline, even as the mother of dragons, and how she's not willing to sacrifice her dragons no matter what. That's very important to her. Even as desperate as she is to get those ships, she's not going to sacrifice a single dragon to achieve that goal. Then we also have Catelyn and Cersei. And although all three of these women, Catelyn and Cersei and Daenerys, they all have different motivations at this point, obviously. You could see how the loyalty, the fierceness of being a mother is very much alive in all three women. And particularly with Catelyn and with Cersei, you see how there's some bitterness about how they've been treated throughout their lives as women and how the men either didn't listen to them in the case of Cersei or denied them certain privileges or just didn't stick around, left them behind, as in the case with Catelyn. And that maybe informed her decision to take the journey she took, but at what cost when she hears the news about Bran and Rickon. Anyhow, so those were just some different roles that I noticed, and I feel like they kind of have parallels into the prologue. But another thing to mention is that number 3, as was mentioned with Patchface and with Crescent, my old maester, and with the sad girl, that number 3 does come up a couple of times. This may be a stretch, but I did happen to notice, of course, the 3 treasons that Daenerys is warned about, and also the 3 death wishes that Arya receives. That might be a stretch. The number 3 is significant in numerous books and places and culture and life and everything. But I did happen to notice that. And the other big thing, too, is, of course, the way in which Crescent is discarded, even after being so loyal and being so true and offering so many years of service. It might as well have been for nothing in the end. And I couldn't help but think of poor Tyrion in his role as Hand, how he's so easily replaced by his father when his father comes back. So I feel like that's kind of a sad truth that comes up in the story, how easily you could be replaced and discarded, and how you should never be complacent in this world. Another thing to mention is about the shadow that Patchface keeps bringing up over and over again. Of course, we know that there was that shadow that ends up killing Renly. I'm pretty sure that that's the connection, but I'm sure there might be some other things there too. But this whole entire idea about the Lord of Light and shadow, I find that interesting because it is the Lord of Light and it was a shadow that killed Renly. And there is an argument at some point in the book between Davos and Melisandre about shadow and a torch, which one is the friend, which one is the foe, that kind of thing. But the role of shadow and the role of light, I feel like those are things that do come up quite a bit, light being fire especially. That is something that comes up quite a bit in this book. And the other thing too is, of course, when Cersei mentions to Sansa the whole council thing about how to be a queen and what to expect, the idea that love is poison also stood out to me on this reread, especially because we have poison in the beginning part of this prologue. Poison does come up in this series a bit too. So I think that that's interesting, though, just to notice those parallels. Though some of those might be a little bit of a stretch, but they were things I noticed, and I thought it'd be kind of a fun way to talk about this book. So please let me know in the comment section below any of your thoughts. If you have any other connections that maybe I didn't point out, or any thoughts at all about what I shared, I'd love to hear from you. So that is it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.